Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able this evening to welcome back to the Kennedy School Vernon Jordan. I say welcome back because we like to claim a little bit of his many accomplishments by noting the fact that he was a fellow at the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School in 1969 and 70, so someone of whom we're justly proud. Vernon Jordan was born in Atlanta, and he became an outstanding civil rights leader as early as 1961, when he helped to escort an African-American student past an angry mob at the University of Georgia. And over the next 20 years, he became one of the most influential voices against racial discrimination in this country. And indeed, when you look at his career, he was associated with almost all of the great organizations and successes. From 61 to 63, he was the Georgia field director of the NAACP, where he led a boycott of stores in Augusta that refused to hire black workers. In 64, he served for 4 years as director of the Voter Education Project of the Southern Regional Council, where he led voter registration drives. From 70 to 71, he worked as executive director of the United Negro College Fund, and the following year became president of the National Urban League, a position which he served until 1981. In 1980, Vernon Jordan was shot by a white supremacist following a speech on race relations in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Fortunately, he recovered to go on to continue to be an influential voice in this country and an important leader. He became a senior partner of the influential firm of Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, and as a close associate of Bill Clinton's, he headed Clinton's transition team in 1992 and 1993, along with Warren Christopher. Deeply committed to anti-discrimination practices, he sits on the board of directors of 11 major corporations and organizations where he pushes for increased hiring of women and minorities. In October of this year, Vernon Jordan published his memoir, Vernon Can Read, a powerful contribution of the history of the struggle for full integration and racial equality in this country. Please join me in welcoming Vernon Jordan back to Harvard this evening.
Thank you very much, Dean Nye. I am honored, privileged to return to this campus, to the Institute of Politics, and to the Kennedy School of Government. I spent some time here in 1969. I was here for 6 months, and I had a wonderful time. I even taught a study group. That was the most difficult time. Never quite being sure what I was going to be asked and what I wouldn't know the answer to, but it was marvelous. And I have, as I stand here, great memories of the Institute of Politics, Dick Neustadt, who recruited me as a fellow, who took care of me, Jim Vorenberg, then a professor, then dean of the law school, really took very good care of me, took me in. His widow, Betty, is somewhere here. I also remember commencement at 1978 here at Harvard University, where I was awarded an honorary degree for which I am still grateful. It is wonderful to have degrees for which you do not have to write a term paper. And I am very appreciative of that. I have just wonderful memories. A lot has happened since I got here. First of all, I missed the Yellow House. That's where the Institute of Politics used to be. And if I were in charge, Joe, that's where it would still be, because I miss it so much. And I had a great time there with Graham Allison. We were fellows together, and it's nice to see Graham. But what is interesting about being here is that I have not seen so many Clinton Democrats in one place since we left office. There's also one Clinton Republican here, David Gergen, and I'm glad to see I'm glad to see everybody. I'm glad to see Betty Bornberg, my friend. I've had many titles in my life: lawyer, civil rights leader, first friend, chairman, banker. But I now have a new title: author. And I like it. And I like this book business. And I like the people in the bookstores. As I've gone around the country talking about my book, because they are the people who spend their days trying to expand the minds and broaden the horizons of the American citizenry through books. And so this has been a great business. Now, I have a co-author. And I want to tell you how I found her. I have 8 grandchildren, and one Saturday, I'd spent an hour or better with 2 of the 8. For those of you who are grandparents, you would agree with me that grandchildren can be delightful and entertaining, but they can also be, Professor Ogletree, exhausting. So these 2, Doogie and Jackie, had absolutely exhausted me one Saturday afternoon. And being exhausted and not wanting to go home because I would have had to explain to Ann, my wife, everything that I did with the grandchildren. So instead I went to Politics and Prose, a bookstore. A very good place to get lost when you are tired. And so I went to the Politics and Prose bookstore. I went, as I usually do, to the biography section. And there under J's was this blue book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, by Annette Gordon Reed, whom I had never heard of. And I stood in the bookstore and I read her introduction to Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy. And in the middle of that introduction, it was clear to me that I had found the person that I wanted to help me with my memoir. Monday morning, I called her up at New York Law School, where she is a professor. She did not answer the phone. I got her voicemail. I hate voicemail. Hate it. In any event, I left her a message. The message said, "My name is Vernon Jordan. I'm a Jefferson devotee. I'm in love with Sally Hemings. I want to write a memoir. I would like for you to help me write my memoir. Will you have lunch with me in New York tomorrow?" Annette Gordon Reed came to lunch, and subsequent thereto, she agreed to help me with my memoir. She is from East Texas. She's a graduate of Dartmouth College. She's a graduate of the Harvard University Law School, the first black woman to make law review. And she is my friend. And she is here tonight. Annette Gordon Reed, stand up. We have had a marvelous time with my life, at least a portion of it. And that is the age of my daughter Vicky, and in the same age group with my 3 stepchildren. And so to be able to talk to a lawyer and a historian as an old lawyer was a great experience. And as we went through this process, I certainly learned a lot, and maybe Annette learned a thing or two too. Now, why did I write this book, this memoir? The motivation for it comes from my daughter Vicky. In 1970, my then wife Shirley, Vicky, and I moved to New York, where I took over as the executive director of the United Negro College Fund. And we severed all family ties and connections in Atlanta, and we took with us Mrs. Gaines, our housekeeper. Mrs. Gaines not only made dinner for us, Mrs. Gaines ate dinner with us. And the conversation was always about whatever. This particular night, the conversation was about how Mrs. Gaines got from Cuthbert, Georgia, to Gainesville, Florida, to begin a new life in the spring of 1950. And Mrs. Gaines was explaining to us at the dinner table how when she got on the bus at Cuthbert, that's just below Columbus, Georgia, right across the state line from Phoenix City, Alabama, there was a white bus driver and one white male passenger. She went to the center of the bus and sat next to the window. Down the road a piece about Blakely, Georgia, that's Early County. Another white male passenger got on the bus and walked to where Mrs. Gaines was sitting and said to Mrs. Gaines, "I want your seat, and I want you to move to the back." And Vicky, my 11-year-old child, said, "What did you do, Mrs. Gaines?" And Mrs. Gaines said, "I moved, Vicky." And Vicky, asserting her constitutional militance, said, "Mrs. Gaines, I wouldn't have moved. I would have sat on my constitutional rights. I would not have let that white man make me move." And Mrs. Gaines, a very gentle woman, touched Vicky on the hand and said, "Vicky, you would have moved." And it occurred to me, Professor Gates, that my child had absolutely no idea what it was like to be black in the South in 1950. And she had no idea what terror would have confronted Mrs. Gaines had she not moved. And it was at that point that I made a promise to myself that at some point I would write my experiences as a kid and as a professional growing up in the South. Now, since we have completed this book, and as I have dealt with the media, everybody wants to know why this book stops in 1982. If you're doing Matt Lauer or Brian Gumbel, you don't have time to tell it. I got time tonight, and I'll tell you. First of all, it ends in 1981, basically, because that was the end of my nonprofit 501c3 eleemosynary activity. That was before I moved to Aiken Gump Strauss Howe and fell as a senior partner to the for-profit sector. So that is a natural cleavage. But secondly, the part of my life that I have written about was the best and the most exciting part of my life, because it was about watching America change. It was about having a hand in helping America to change, and it was about becoming a beneficiary of that change. It was also the time, the period, when we black people, with the help of a lot of white people, turned America upside up, inside out, and upside down. It was, as Annette said in the Boston Globe today, it was the Second American Revolution. And it was crucial. Thirdly, had not there been a civil rights movement in which I am honored to have been a participant, there would not have been a senior partnership at a law firm. there would not have been corporate directorships. There would not have been a place at Lazard. Those are all direct results of the civil rights movement. And the final reason for writing and ending in 1981 is that most people in America, especially white people, have some erroneous notion that I was born January 20th, 1993. And the fact is, before that, I had a full, exciting, successful life, and that's what I've written about. And the final reason, it's my book. I write about what I want to write about. There is some controversy, or some dispute, even within the family, from some of my kids and even my wife, about the title of this book, Vernon Can Read. My wife said, that title does not have any intellectual content. And she said it ought to, you got to have another title that's too simplistic, it's not good. And for those of you, well, domestic tranquility is very important to me. But I finally said to my wife, it's my book. In 1955, I was a sophomore at DePaul University in Greencastle, Indiana. And in the second semester, the Continental Insurance Company came to campus to hire summer interns. I interviewed to be a summer intern, and I was made a summer intern in the Atlanta office of Continental Insurance Company. And so, at the end of school, I went home on the day appointed, put on my best suit, and shined my shoes, white shirt, tie, and went to the Fulton National Bank building to the Continental Insurance office. And I presented myself to the receptionist, and I said proudly, my name is Vernon Jordan, I'm a sophomore at DePaul University, and I am a summer intern here. The secretary looked up at me and she said, no shit. And she picks up the telephone and she says to the management guy in charge of some interns, she says, there's a colored boy out here who says that he is a summer intern. Can you believe this? The man shows, takes me into his office and says, they did not tell us. And I said, they did not tell you what? He said, they did not tell us that you were colored. That was before we graduated to Negro and then to black. And so I said, what are you going to do about it? He said, you come back tomorrow. I went back the next day, and he said, we have found you an office on Auburn Avenue, the black business district of Atlanta then. And it's at the J.R. Wolf Realty Company, and you're to be there, and I will come down and we will go call on these clients. We were selling income protection insurance to employers of 5 or more people. And I did not like that job very much. And I told my mother that I was going to quit. And my mother, who had the biggest and best catering service in Atlanta at the time, found me a job. She found me a job as a chauffeur/butler for Robert F. Maddox, a retired Atlanta banker. Robert F. Maddox sat on the platform in 1895 when Booker T. Washington gave the Atlanta Exposition Address, which I heard at your house. That's the speech where Booker Washington says we can be as separate as the fingers on the hand, yet one in mutual progress. A year later, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson, which established separate but equal as a legal theory that haunted this country for 50 years. Mr. Maddox was mayor of Atlanta in 1910. He was president of the First National Bank of Atlanta, the American Bankers Association, and to really explain him, he was president of the Garden Clubs of America. Mr. Maddox was the definition, the epitome of Southern aristocracy of that time. He was both rich and mean. But I was his chauffeur. And every morning in the 1940 LaSalle, gears in the floor, I would pick up Lizzie the cook. And we would go to his estate, Woodmere, at the corner of Woodmere and West Paces Fair Road. And Lizzie would make 3 breakfasts, one for Mr. Maddox, which he served upstairs, one for me, which I ate in the butler's pantry, and one for Troy, the yard man, which he ate on the black porch. Even in menial circumstances, there are gradations. And then at some point in time, Mr. Maddox, you never knew when, would come downstairs, reach in a barrel of many canes and get a cane, reach on a mahogany table and get one of many straw hats, and would get into the back of this 4-door blue Cadillac, and I, in my chauffeur's uniform and cap, would drive him around the property and stop at the Rose Garden, where Troy would appear with a rose, a different rose every day for the lapel of his Palm Beach suit, which I had pressed the afternoon before. And we would leave. We would turn left on West Paces Ferry Road, right on Havisham Road, left on Peachtree Battle, and then right on Peachtree Street. And we would go to the First National Bank, where he would stay 10 minutes, 30 minutes, never more than an hour, because he really had nothing to do, being retired. And then we would go to the Capital City Club. And there he and James Dickey and James Robinson Sr., who was a grandson of James Robinson III, who was the chairman of American Express Company, where I sit as a senior director. The Lord moves in mysterious ways. My daughter, Toni Cook Bush, sits as a director of the Continental Insurance Company. The Lord moves in mysterious ways. And they would go to the Capital City Club and have either mint julep or whiskey sour and a bowl of jellied consomme. And then we would return to the big house. And Mr. Maddox would go up for his nap, and I had nothing to do until my responsibilities as butler kicked in at 6:15 when we served dinner. And over the loud protestations of Lizzie the cook, I would sit in Mr. Maddox's absolutely gorgeous library and read all afternoon. And Lizzie didn't like it, and she was vehement in her conversation with me about Mr. Maddox's library. And so I said, Lizzie, I'll make a deal with you. If you don't tell Mr. Maddox I'm reading in this library, I won't tell Mr. Maddox about you and the grocery man. Now, Lizzie's deal with the grocery man was that if the groceries at the end of the week cost $2.25, the grocery man charged $300. And then on Friday, when Lizzie got into the 1940 LaSalle, she would have 2 hens, a ham, and a turkey for dinner after church at the Mount Zion Baptist Church, where she was the pianist. So Lizzie left me alone. And I am in the library reading one afternoon, and Mr. Maddox was not able to sleep, and so he's walking around the house, this great big house, in his underwear, with a bottle of Southern Comfort in one hand. I know your students don't know what Southern Comfort is, but a bottle of Southern Comfort in one hand and a glass in the other. And he comes into the library, and he says, Vernon, what are you doing in my library? And I said, I'm reading, Mr. Maddox. And he said, I've never had one of you work for me who could read. And I said, Mr. Maddox, I can read, I'm college. He said, you go to those colored schools over there, meaning Morehouse, Morris, Brown, or Clark? And I said, no, I go to DePaul University in Greencastle, Indiana. White children go to that school? White girls go to that school? Yes, sir. And then he asks a question that defines him and defines Southern aristocracy of that time. He said, are you going to be a preacher or a teacher? And I said, I'm going to be a lawyer. He said, you all aren't supposed to be lawyers. I said, I'm going to be a lawyer. And then he said, don't you know I got a place downstairs for you all to relax? And I said, yes, but you have these marvelous books, great books. You don't want them down there in that old dusty place. And he said, well, just read then. Just read. And he storms out. At 6:15, I have changed. I've taken off this long black tie and put on a bow tie, a white jacket, and I have a towel around my arm. And I am serving Liz's vichyssoise to Mr. Maddox and his family, the first course for dinner. They had had some drinks. And Mr. Maddox says, I have an announcement to make. Yes, Papa, Vernon can read. The next day, we have Mr. Maddox and Mr. Dickey in the back of the car, and I'm driving along. And Mr. Maddox says to Mr. Dickey, Bob, yes, Jim, Vernon can read. I do not know, I cannot prove this as I say in the book, but in 1961, when I escorted Charlene through the mobs at the University of Georgia pursuant to a court order by Judge Boodle, Mr. Maddox, who had moved out of the big house and into an apartment, was watching this process on television. And Mrs. Henderson, his nurse, this is handed down through the maids and the chauffeurs and the cooks, who always knew what was going on in the big house, right? Professor? Yeah. Now, as I'm escorting Charlene on television, Mrs. Henderson says to Mr. Maddox, Mr. Maddox, do you know who that colored lawyer is, escort that colored girl to the University of Georgia? He says, no. She says, it's your chauffeur, Vernon. He says, I always knew he was up to no good. That is the title of my book, and it's right, and I like it. I was asked the other day in Cleveland, what was the most exciting time in your career as a lawyer? It was a judge who asked the question, and I think the judge thought that I was going to talk about some merger and acquisition that I had been involved in at Aiken-Gump, or some international negotiation in which I had been successful, or some public policy issue on which we had lobbied to Congress. And I said, the proudest moment of my time as a lawyer was 2 months after law school. I was working for Donald L. Hollowell for $35 a week, happily. And Don Hollowell, C.B. King, Shaveen Bowers King, then the only lawyer south of Atlanta in Albany, Georgia, and I were in Reedsville, Georgia, trying a motion for new trial for James Fair Jr., an 18-year-old black man who had been accused of murder. He was in Early County, Blakely, Georgia, the same place that white man got on the bus. He was arrested, arraigned, tried, convicted, and sentenced to die in an electric chair in 48 hours. And we had to spend the night in Dublin, Georgia, 30 miles away from Reidsville, Georgia, because that was the only colored motel in the area. This is 1960. Court would begin about 8:30. We would break for lunch about 11:30. The judge, the prosecutors, and all of the white court officials would go across the street to the only cafe in town and have a nice hot lunch. Hollowell, King, and Jordan went to the only grocery store in town. We bought a loaf of bread, a pound of bologna, a jar of mustard, a Coca-Cola, and a Baby Ruth, and we sat in Hollowell's car. And we ate our lunch. We did it on Monday, and we did it on Tuesday. Wednesday morning, as the trial was proceeding, a black woman who sat upstairs, because black people had to sit upstairs in those days in Georgia courts and in most courts in the South, dropped a book. I was a young flunky lawyer, so I turned around and she beckons me to meet her in the vestibule, and I go meet her, and she said to me, she said, "Lawyer, we've been watching you all eat that bologna now for 2 days." She said, "Don't eat that bologna today." She said, "You finish court about 3:30, and when you finish, turn right at the only red light in town and go down the road till you see the True Age sign and turn left, and then go about a quarter of a mile, there's a big oak tree, and that's my house." And that's what we did. And when we got there, there were 10 black women in their best sundresses and aprons, and their husbands had come home and cleaned up and had on clean shirts and nice pants. And the table was set for royalty. Her best linen, her best china, her best crystal, her best silver. And the table was replete with the best Southern meal I think I have ever eaten. But it is not the meal that I remember. What I remember is one sentence from her husband's prayer as we stood around the table holding hands for grace. And he said, "Lord, down here in Tatnall County, we can't join the NAACP, but thanks to your bountiful blessings, we can feed the NAACP lawyers. Lord, way down here in Tatnall County, we can't join the NAACP, but thanks to your bountiful blessings, we can feed the NAACP lawyers." It was then that I understood why I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. It was then that I understood why I went to Howard University Law School to study under Jim Nabritt. It was then that I understood why I was in Reidsville with Don Hollowell and C.B. King. It was also then that I understood that not everybody could be a freedom rider. Not everybody could sit in. Not everybody could go across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But these humble, fearful, yet courageous black people gave what they had as best they could under the circumstances, and I believe the preparation of that meal was as important to them as going across the Edmund Pettus Bridge was as important to those who made the trip. I shall never forget it, because I then knew why I was an NAACP lawyer. I ran the Voter Education Project. Betty Vornberg, who ran the Joint Foundation Support, gave me money to help run it. And what I understood about the importance of the Voter Education Project, which I was privileged to run, succeeding Wiley Brandt, all came clear 3 days after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. in Wilcox County, Alabama. When the federal registrar showed up in Wilcox County, Alabama, pursuant to the voting rights law, there were so many black people lined up that they had to send them away and say, come back the next day. In line was a 90-year-old black man who, when he got up to the registrar, put down his age. The registrar looked at him, and there he was, dressed in his Sunday best. But his face showed all of the meanness of his 90 years of living in Wilcox County. And the registrar asked him, he said, sir, this thing says that you are 90 years old. He says, I am. He said, what took you so long to get here? And the old man said, all my life, I've had a philosophy of never getting in the way of trouble a coming. And the registrar said, well, why are you here today? And the old man said, because trouble ain't a coming like it used to did. It was then that I understood why I was running the Voter Education Project. And then I was privileged to run the United Negro College Fund. And I tell you, when I understood that, I was given the commencement at Livingstone College in North Carolina, Elizabeth Thole's hometown. And I had given what I thought was a pretty good commencement speech, and then they started calling the names, 125 graduates as they came across. 98% of that class were the first in their college, first in their families to ever go to college. 90% of them were on some form of student aid. And in that packed, non-air-conditioned building, as one young man came across the stage, and the moment that he shook the president's hand, and the moment that he touched that diploma, way up in the back, a black woman dressed in her finest JCPenney outfit jumped up the moment he touched the diploma, and she cried out, "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus." She took in laundry from white people to make sure that boy graduated from Livingstone College. It was then that I understood my time at the United Negro College Fund. The Urban League was a great experience for me, my last assignment, my last stewardship in the Civil Rights Movement. And I was on a talk show with Herb Kupcinet, I think that's right. And we got through with the interview and we had call-ins. And some black guy called and he said, "Jordan, you're just a middle-class Negro in your suit, and you don't do a damn thing for anybody." And I said, "You're entitled to your opinion." But the next call came from a lady on the South Side, and she said, "Mr. Kupcinet, I just want to tell the fellow who just called, Mr. Jordan, that I came here from Mississippi, and I didn't know anything about the city, and I didn't have much training, but I went to the Urban League, and now I have a good job, and I can take care of my family." I understood why I was Whitney Young's successor. I have one concluding story. It's about another old man in my life. Same age about as Mr. Maddox. The difference is that he's my grandpa, Jim Griggs. When I was a little boy, I would take an invalid uncle to Talbot County for homecoming, a great Southern tradition, to go back to the home church the third Sunday in August, and revival took place every night of the week except Saturday. Then Sunday there was a big church service, and then after the church service they spread dinner on the church grounds. Well, I looked forward to going to Talbot County. And I looked forward to my conversations with my grandpa, who was a sharecropper on Mr. Robert Carrier's place. And in 1947, 12 years old, I finally got up the nerve to ask my grandpa something that I'd want to ask him for 2 years. And we're sitting on the porch of his roadside shanty in rocking chairs. And I said, "Pa, I'd like to ask you a question." He said, "What is it, boy?" And I said, "Pa, at 70 years old, way down here in Talbot County on Mr. Robert Carrier's place, what is it, Pa, that you want most out of life?" And my grandfather reared up from that rocking chair, gathered that tobacco and snuff that he had in his mouth, and spit it all the way to the highway. He could do that with great accuracy. And he leaned back in his rocking chair and he said, "Junior, at 70 years old, way down here in Talbot County, on Mr. Robert Carrier's place, all I want out of life is to be able to go to the bathroom indoors in a warm place one time before I die." Junior, at 70 years old, way down here in Talbot County, on Mr. Robert Carrier's place, all I want out of life is to be able to go to the bathroom indoors in a warm place one time before I die. Skip, that was my grandfather's highest aspiration. That was his impossible dream. That was what he wanted most out of life. And I have never forgotten that my grandfather did not say to me, "Junior, I want to learn to read and write." He didn't say, "I'd like to learn math so that when I negotiate my sharecropper deal with Mr. Carrier that I won't be in a debit situation every time we negotiate." He didn't say that I want to be able to register to vote. I want to go to the library. I want to sit in at the lunch counter. My grandfather's ultimate aspiration was a basic creature comfort, because his life had been so defined and circumvented and circumscribed by mean, vicious system called Jim Crow segregation. And my grandfather had absolutely no idea, no dream that Junior would go to college and to law school and to Harvard and do good things, or try to do good things. He had no idea. So my life has got these bookends. Mr. Maddox, whose negativism is reflected in, are you going to be a teacher or a preacher? And my grandfather, whose circumstances were so blinded that he could not envision simple things of accomplishment for Junior. Thank you very much.
Not only a pretty good lawyer, a pretty good teacher and preacher too. We have microphones here on the floor and in the two balconies, and I'd like you to please identify yourself and your relation to the university. And I'd like only one question per person, since there'll be several who want to ask. So let's start with the mic here.
Okay. How are you, Mr. Jordan? My name is Omar Abdul Malik. I'm from Washington, D.C. And I would like to take this opportunity to personally apologize to you for blocking your driveway on Fridays when I was going to the mosque on Massachusetts Avenue.
You know where I live.
I was running late.
All right.
Anyway, my question to you is, the events of 9/11 had a big effect on the country, and from watching the media, you would think that there was no opinion or no difference of opinion of the events from African Americans. And I wondered if you had noticed that, first of all, and secondly, if you felt that there was a different response that we had to that event.
My office is on the 62nd floor of Rockefeller Center. And my secretary came into my office saying that a plane had hit the first tower. And obviously I stood at the window watching the first tower, and I said to the colleague with whom I was meeting, I said, there's been an accident in the first tower. And then I was standing there watching as the second plane hit the second tower. I was also standing there traumatized and horrified as the second building fell first and the first building fell second. And then we were evacuated from Rockefeller Center. And I remember walking up Fifth Avenue with people who were in a state the likes of which I have never experienced before. And I went home, and my son worked in WTC 7, but was on a call. My daughter, had she not had a breakfast meeting in town, would have been getting off the subway at the World Trade Center. She worked at Dow Jones. And we have another daughter who works not far away. And obviously our first responsibility was to check on our children, and thankfully they were all right. And then as we were doing the Kennedy assassinations, we were all fixed on the television. And I'll tell you what I thought. I thought that this was terrorism from abroad, piercing our security and puncturing our sense of ourselves. But my second thought was that terrorism was not a stranger to black people, that slavery was a form of terrorism, that lynching was terrorism, that what happened to the 4 little girls in Birmingham was terrorism, what happened to Martin and Medgar and Malcolm and Vernon Dahmer was terrorism, what happened to Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner was terrorism, but it was a different kind. It was from our neighbors right here in the South, in Hattiesburg and in Birmingham and in Jackson. And I thirdly thought that when we in the civil rights movement were hit with terrorism, we mourned and we were sad and we were crying. But we also kept on walking and we kept on talking, walking up to freedom's way. And I believe that if the American people believe in democracy and the democratic institution as a way of life, and if they believe in the free markets, that we too, despite our sadness and our mournful state, have to keep on walking and keep on talking and walking up to freedom's way. I also thought, as I watched the memorial prayer service that Friday, that there was no national prayer service for the 4 little girls in Birmingham. And I wanted to feel badly about that, but then it also dawned on me that if that were to happen again, there would be. So there is some progress here. And as you watch people react, you saw all kind of people hugging and crying. All kind of people. And that seemed to me to be the best expression of what America is and ought to be about.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
My name is John Connors. I'm from Boston, and I'm a guest at the Institute of Politics. And my question is, Mr. Jordan, would you care to comment on the Supreme Court, the existing makeup of the Supreme Court, the possibility that there will be some vacancies to be filled over the next few years, and what effect you think that will have on all the progress that has been made in the civil rights movement?
Well, if the appointment of the current Attorney General is any example, we're in for a bad way and a bad time.
My name is Chris Howard. I'm at the business school, and like you, I had my 501c3 life before this. I was an Air Force officer, and I'm at the business school, so now I'm having my time at making a few dollars.
That's not unconstitutional, so. Oh.
But I wanted to say that about 10 years ago when I was a young student at Oxford University, I heard Professor Gates give a talk. And I know I look young, so you guys can compliment me on that. But 10 years ago, when I was a young 22-year-old, listening to Professor Gates speak, someone asked him a question about the black community, and he said, rather wryly, that if there's an African-American community, let me have the fax number. I want to send them something. And so the question becomes, is there such an entity as the African-American community? And the other part of the question is if there is an African-American community, there's always talk that there should be a leader. That leader has traditionally come from a civil rights, theological, seminary background. There's talk now that perhaps if there is a black community, that leader should come from perhaps elsewhere, perhaps from business, from Wall Street or what have you. I was just curious of your thoughts on those 2 points.
Yeah. First of all, if you go back to 1963, the March of 1963, you saw black leadership at its highest and best. So Martin, Whitney, Roy, John Lewis, Dorothy Hyde, Benny Mays, A. Philip Randolph, Bide Rustin. Couldn't get Stokely, couldn't get any better than that. As a result of the process, 5 new leadership classes in the black community just sprouted. And I tell you what they are. The first is a black elected official. There were no black elected officials. It was Powell and Dawson in the Congress. So the black elected official is a new phenomenon in the society, brand new. The second is blacks who manage predominantly white institutions. That's a brand new phenomenon. When Cliff Warden went to Michigan State, when Frank Thomas went to head up the Ford Foundation, that was all brand new. Black men running basic, predominantly white institutions with both the human and fiscal resources to manage it. Brand new leadership class. The third new leadership class is blacks who pierce the corporate veil from the boardroom to the executive suite. That's all brand new. Brand new. The fourth is indigenous leadership in the black community. Historically, all of the leadership in the black community were talented 10. They all went to college. They were the NAACP and the Urban League. But the Urban Renewal Program, the Poverty Program, the VEP, they integrated the talented 10. And they are strong, and they are potent, and they are powerful. And they're good, and they care. And the fifth new black leadership class is the new black entrepreneur whose business is not relegated to Auburn Avenue or to 125th Street, but who sells as, you know, there used to be a sausage company called Parks Sausage. Very few people knew that Parks was a black man from Baltimore. Parks Sausage's mom. When I lived in Westchester, that's all the white people ate Parks sausage. I never told them that was Henry Parks' company. And at the right time, he sold it to a company in Miami, made a lot of money, and went on. So there are new leadership classes. Also, new occasions teach new duties. The civil rights movement today cannot be like it was then. Then it was defining the right to check in. Now it's about the wherewithal to check out. You know, it's easy to check in. They let you check in, but when you get ready to leave, you got to have a transaction. And that requires a credit card, money, job. And so that's what it's about. And part of the difficulty is that everybody wants to relive what won't be anymore. And it can't be, and it's not the same. Now, also I think you have to understand that there's a distinction between black leaders and leading blacks. When I had a constituency, the National Urban League, I was a black leader. But when I became a lawyer, I became a leading black. Do you understand? And there's a difference, because I do not, when I talk now, I don't talk for anybody but me. But when I was head of the Urban League or the College Fund or the VEP, I had a constituency and an agenda, and that was different. Now, business guys can't be civil rights leaders, in part because you can't serve God and mammon. I mean, it's impossible. But historically, the black business leadership has always supported the movement. If you go back to the Montgomery bus boycott, all of the black business guys supported. If you go back to the case in Tuskegee, Gomillion versus Lightfoot, gerrymandering case, that was all paid for by black business guys. So there is a role for everybody. And one of the reasons I quit, because I was so good that nobody ought to be embalmed in office. And so we ought to have change. But historically, that was not possible. All of the black college presidents stayed there forever because there was no place to graduate to. There was no place to parlay that experience. But thanks to the civil rights movement, it opened doors and made that possible.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, sir.
Hi there. I'm Benjamin Bolger. I'm a real estate student here, and prior to that, I was an intern in the Clinton administration. And what my question is that Cornel West was here a little while ago, and he was talking about the issue of reparations and trying to address historical injustices, but also trying to move forward in America. And I guess I'd like to know your viewpoint on what's the best way to address prior injustices that still have not been addressed.
Yeah, I'm going to leave that to Professor Ogletree, and I'm going to leave that to Professor West. They are academics, and they can afford that exercise. And so I'm gonna leave it to them. I don't know anything about it. and that ain't my game. Okay? What you have to know in life is what you can do and what you can't do. And so I'm gonna leave that to them. And that's my answer, I'm serious.
Hey, Mr. Jordan. My name's Dan, and my friend Caitlin and I are in a Harlem Renaissance class with Professor Gates. And you talked a lot about people being subject to the system and stuff. And I was wondering, having lived through the 60s and also being an avid reader, what role you think culture and cultural movements play in changing systems?
I think culture is important, and I think it's crucial. And I remember going to San Antonio the first time I met Henry Cisneros, and we were trying to share with the Latino community our experiences at the Voter Education Project. And so I said, I have come here with a soul song trying to get a Latin beat because it was both, it was necessary. And so I think culture is very important. But I also believe that, just everybody in America sort of wants the same thing, basically. A little white house with green shutters with a white picket fence, a good job at a good wage, tuition for the children, 2 weeks at the beach, good insurance, a good life, a decent burial, and you leave something for the children. That's basically what living is all about, for everybody. That's why people come here. They want a good life. And so, but when they come, they bring things with them, and things get shared. And when I first went to DePaul University, for example, talking about culture, I had grown up in the St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. And the first Sunday I was there, I went to hear Howard Thurman preach at Goban Memorial Methodist Church. There were 5 black people in the church: my mother, my father, me, and my brother, and Howard Thurman. And when they got up to sing the first congregational hymn, it was a great culture shock to me. And I decided at that moment, I've since learned, that white people cannot sing because it was so different from, you can have all the world but give me Jesus. And so culture is very important. Yes, sir.
In the balcony, didn't got skipped.
Hi.
Hello, sir. My name is Makani Tungara. I'm a senior here at the college. And I was wondering what you felt was the future of the civil rights movement. How can organizations, for example, such as the NAACP, renew their meaning and their goal for a new generation of African Americans?
Well, part of your question suggests that maybe there isn't a civil rights movement. So, and that's a matter of definition. Like I said, if you expect it to be going across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you don't do that anymore. And it's not effective. Somebody wrote New Occasions Teach New Duties, and so they're working at things. There was a time we had no help. There was nobody that you could turn to. There was nobody in Washington that we could call up. And we didn't start winning Supreme Court cases until the lawyers started having drinks with the other lawyers. And so now that is changing, and that the issues are not so much black and white, they're gray. But the fact of the matter is, this is still a color-conscious society. And anybody who tells you that we are a colorblind society is in fact blind themselves. And so there is still a lot to do, and there is really a lot to do when the Attorney General of the United States is having prayer meetings in the Department of Justice. There is a lot to do when the Attorney General of the United States who's a states' rights guy, who is messing with the Colorado law. There's a lot to do when the Attorney General of the United States is raiding some place that is giving marijuana to people with AIDS and cancer in violation of state law. So there is much work to be done. And let me tell you what part of the problem is. When I came out of law school in 1960, June of 1960, there was no job for me in my hometown of Atlanta as a lawyer in the city government, the county government, the state government, or the federal government. And there was no job for me in a law firm. Fact of the matter, the bar review course in Georgia in 1960 was segregated. You could not get in the bar review course to take the bar exam. So while I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, that was also my only choice. Now, I'll tell you this, I had a chance to go and work for a commercial lawyer, black man, who was offering me more than $35 a week. He was offering me $50 a week. And I went to interview him. And when I interviewed him, I walked in his office, and sitting in the middle of his desk was a great big quart of scotch. Now, the ladies in white at St. Paul AME Church, where I grew up, literally delayed dying until I got out of law school to write their wills. And if they had come to that office where I was and saw that bottle of scotch on that lawyer's desk, they would have concluded that education has ruined that Jordan boy. And so I couldn't go to work there. I could not go to work there and did not go to work there. When you come out of here, you can come to Lazard, you can go to Citibank, you can go places that my wife came out of Vassar in 1955, had a job at Chase Bank until they figured out she was a black girl from Tuskegee, Alabama. So it's different. So the options are different. But wherever we are and whatever we are doing, if we are doing it well, that's part of the movement. We're paving the way, we're cutting a path. And I have great faith in my successor, once removed, at the Urban League, Hugh Price, and Great Grace, and Kwasi Nkrumah. And it is tougher now than it was when I was a civil rights leader. It is much harder. I hope that's satisfactory. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Jordan. My name is Arash Farron. I'm a first year at the business school. It wasn't that long ago that emails came across our screen talking about white fraternity students at a university in America dressing up in blackface and masquerading around making fun of African Americans. I also remember as an undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania, I was always surprised to see when I went to dinner and lunch, to see the white students completely separated from black students as we sat down to eat. And even in the dormitories, the white students were completely separated by choice from the black students. And when I hear about these sort of events, I sit here as a 24-year-old worried about what the next few decades have in store. And I'm curious, as you've gone around and traveled through America and spoken about your book and about your past experiences, and this sort of relates to the previous question, but how worried should I be as a 24-year-old? How worried should I be that I'm isolated in ivory tower at Harvard, isolated from these sort of incidents? And what can I do as a 20-something to prevent the sort of events you saw firsthand from repeating themselves in the decades to come?
Well, first you got to believe, as you obviously do, that what is right is right. And then you have to figure out how and where you're going to do something about it. And I don't know where and how you ought to do something about it, because you got to figure that out. This is the second time I've been asked about these things at Auburn and some other place. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of people still have a long way to go on the issue of race and sex. And they are still growing up, and they got a lot of growing up to do. What is interesting is that when Charlene Hunter actually got into the University of Georgia, they put on the ground floor. And the white girls who lived upstairs over her took turns every night beating on the pipes. She studied for those girls taking turns beating on the pipes. That's the way she studied. And she graduated. She's a distinguished alumnus. There's a building name for a program, all that. But she kept studying. Those same girls, a few years later, were in the stadium at the Georgia Tech football game cheering for Herschel Walker. The Lord moves in mysterious ways. And so I think first you got to believe it, and you got to figure out how you want to act on your belief. And I would be a very unwise man to tell you how to do that.
This will have to be our last question.
Mr. Jordan, my name is Rayford Davis. I'm from Decatur, Georgia.
Are you?
Yes,
DeKalb County?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. And I'm actually at the business school right now. And I want to thank you for all of your work because I actually went to the Westminster schools on West Paces Ferry, right near where I used to drive.
My daughter went to Trinity School on West Paces Ferry and Moores Mill Road.
Wow, how about that? Small world indeed, small world indeed. And to make it even smaller, my grandfather was a plaintiff in the Gomillion versus Lightfoot case in Tuskegee, Alabama, where my family is from. And with all of that, when you spoke about one of the reasons that you wrote the book is because one of your granddaughters, your daughter, didn't understand what it meant to be black in the South at that time. The question that it popped into my head and that I wrestle with is how are we going to connect our children, in today's time, to that same movement, to have that passion that has driven African Americans for so long to be successful.
Yeah, now the first thing you're going to do is buy my book for them.
Very fair. That's fair. That's fair. But at the same time, as time moves on, I've actually seen it in the kids that I mentor. I don't have children of my own, but in the kids that I mentor, a lot of them, it's hard to give them that connection that drives me, and that drove you, and that drives a lot of the people that are African American and non-African American here.
I'll tell you a story that sort of makes what you say real. In 1984, E.D. Nixon from Montgomery, Alabama, who was one of A. Philip Randolph's Pullman porters, who is the first person that Rosa Parks called when she got arrested. Contrary to popular belief, she did not call Dr. King. She called E.D. Nixon, who was the local president of the NAACP. And it was E.D. Nixon who was a strong leader who had sense enough to know that this thing had gotten beyond him. And it was E.D. Nixon who called the new preacher at Dexter Avenue Church and said, we got a problem, and we need somebody who is colleged and trained to be the leader. He said, this is beyond me. And Martin said, well, Brother Nixon, I'll have to think about it. And Brother Nixon responded, well, you best have thought about it by 8 o'clock because the meeting is at your church. Now, the point is, 2 points. E.D. Nixon knew that he wasn't up to it. But he was so strong in the Montgomery community that he could call a meeting at the preacher's church without talking to the preacher because his alliance was with the head chairman of the deacon board. Now, he was a great man, E.D. Nixon. And he called me up and he said, Mr. Jordan, he said, you know, you're one of the few of those fellows up there who understand what I've done. And he says, I'm 80 years old and I'm going to have a meeting down here honoring me for my 50 years in the civil rights movement. And I said, you tell me when and where and I'll be there. He said, well, now I'm going to pay your transportation, give you an honorarium. I said, you don't have to do anything. You just tell me where and what time and I'll be there. We agreed on the time. 2 days later, I get a call from 2 young black lawyers in Montgomery, Alabama. And they said, Mr. Jordan, yes, we're lawyers so-and-so and so-and-so in Montgomery, Alabama. I said, yes. how are you, blah, blah, blah. And they said, we're calling you because we hear that you're coming down here to make a speech for E.D. Nixon. And I said, that's right, I plan to do that. He says, well, don't you know that E.D. Nixon is an Uncle Tom? I cannot repeat in the sanctity of academia what I responded with. But I said, listen, you little fellas. You are practicing law in Montgomery, Alabama because of the likes of E.D. Nixon. And they had absolutely no idea of who he was and what he had done. And they didn't know that that was the first person that Rosa Parks called. They did not know that. And you know, everybody thinks that Fred Gray was the lawyer that they called. They called a white lawyer, Clifford Durr, Virginia Durr's husband. He was the first lawyer that got him out of jail. We tried, some of us tried to write the white people out of the movement. And that's wrong, because it's inaccurate. But these two lawyers in Montgomery had absolutely no sense of history about a living legend. E.D. Nixon, he was gone now, but he was a great man, trained by A. Philip Randolph as a Pullman porter, a real pillar in the community, who had to make compromises, who had to fight. But every time he made a compromise, he was inching a little further toward freedom. And I tell you that story because your question raises the whole issue about knowledge and information. And I hope everybody will write, if just for their families, what happened and what their experiences were. One of my great heroes in the civil rights movement is Primus King. Nobody's ever heard of Primus King. Primus King was a itinerant Baptist preacher from Columbus, Georgia, Muskogee County. And in 1943, alone, Primus King shows up at the Muskogee County Courthouse to say he wanted to register to vote. And the lady says, you know, you can't vote. He says, I want to register to vote in a white primary, because black people could not vote in a primary, they could only vote in the general election. He says, I want to register to vote in a primary. And the lady said, you can't do that. Primus King says, I'm a citizen, I can read and write, I own property, I pay my taxes, and I have not committed the crime of moral turpitude. And she turned him away. And he drove to Atlanta, got A.T. Walden, got a white lawyer in Augusta and a white lawyer in Columbus to be local counsel, and they got Thurgood. Now, two white lawyers being local counsel in 1943 is quite something, right? So the white people of Muskogee County calls Primus into the courthouse, call them in, sit him down, and they say, now, Primus, you've gotten in touch with that communist lawyer up there named Thurgood Marshall, and you filed this lawsuit, and you have disturbed the peace and tranquility of race relations in Muskogee County in Columbus, Georgia. Now, Primus, we want you to withdraw that lawsuit so we can return to normalcy. And this barber during the week, an itinerant preacher on Sunday, when he went to preach on Sunday, he'd wear a black cutaway coat and gamma-striped breeches and spats. He was unlettered and unlearned. And when he took his text from the first John, he would say the I John. He's my man. And Primus King was told, said, Primus, if you don't withdraw that lawsuit, you could end up in the Chattahoochee River. In 1943, you know what Primus King said? He said, well, white people, if I end up in the Chattahoochee River, at least I'll get thrown in there for something, because all those other colored people got thrown in there for nothing. And I used to go, when I was the state director of NAACP, I used to take him around the churches, and he would preach, shout on Sunday, but reddish on Monday. Now, the sad fact is, not one academic at Atlanta University or Tuskegee, and Columbus sits between the two, has ever done a thesis or dissertation on Primus King. And in some ways, he's more important than Martin. Everywhere Martin went, there was the press. Primus in 1943 was all alone as a plaintiff. The case is called King versus Chapman. You law students, go read it. He was a great man. And nobody has ever paid him any attention. And I talked to Governor Georgia, Governor Barnes. I convinced him that he had to do something about Primus King. So if you go to Columbus, Georgia now, there's a thing called the Primus King Highway. That's all Primus got, was a highway. But for as long as there is legal jurisprudence in this country, you can go to the law library and read King versus Chapman. So that's my response to you. Thank you all very much.
Please join me in thanking Vernon Jordan. You're a hell of a good teacher. You're not a lawyer, you're a good teacher. That's the highest praise here.
Thank you. I'm going to sign the paper.
Vernon Jordan will be signing books at Wordsworth.